A ceasefire would simply freeze the conflict. It would leave the Hamas fighters and their weapon systems, their bunkers and ammunition stores all in place. And it would mean Israel is not secure for the future against a group that is dedicated to killing Jews and annihilating its very existence.
Because one of the suggestions is that Sir Keir Starmer could face the prospect of a vote in Parliament on a ceasefire. That is, of course, because there are a number of his own MPs, including those within the shadow cabinet, who are pushing him to go further. John Healey, I just want to ask you about that point, a vote in Parliament on a ceasefire. Is that something you would welcome?
Well, we'll see if there's a vote. What you've got from Keir Starmer in the last week was making the big arguments, stressing the common ground that is there within Labour and more widely, a desire to see the alleviation of Palestinian suffering and a reduction of the innocent casualties. And the best way to do that is to try and get a break in the fighting, humanitarian pauses, exactly as the US and the European Union have been arguing. A ceasefire would simply freeze the conflict. It would leave the Hamas fighters and their weapon systems, their bunkers and ammunition stores all in place. And it would mean Israel is not secure for the future against a group that is dedicated to killing Jews and annihilating its very existence.
Should the march, the pro-Palestinian march, go ahead next Saturday, do you think?
I hope we're balancing, aren't we, the British right to free speech and to protest. I don't believe a ban is necessary, but it is utterly unacceptable if any protest march interferes or disrespects the honour that we pay to those who serve in the remembrance service at the cenotaph. Now, it'll be an operational matter for the police. They are talking to the organisers, I understand, about a protest march for those who want to demonstrate solidarity with the Palestinians, taking place in a different part of London, and at a time 2 hours after the cenotaph service is done. So I think that's the way, I hope, we'll be able to resolve and balance that right to protest, a very British right, with the requirement that we honour those who serve, and particularly those who've paid the ultimate sacrifice and laying down their lives for the rest of us.
So you wouldn't call them hate marches?
I certainly wouldn't call them hate marches. I think calling them hate marches makes the police's job to police them safely and lawfully more difficult. I think calling them hate marches reinforces the fears and divisions that are there in our communities, and responsible national politicians should be helping to try and make the police's difficult job easier, and they certainly should be helping to reassure fears and try and bring communities together as we try and deal with the huge increase that we've seen in anti-Semitic offences, as well as Islamophobia on our streets of the cities.
Yeah. You are responsible potentially for Labour's defence policy if you get into government in around a year's time. I mean, we've talked a lot in the context of what's happening right now about defence and security. Do you intend to increase the number of troops in the British Army?
Well, we've called for about 2 years for the government to halt further cuts in the British Army at a time when threats are increasing, they're becoming more complex, and at a time when NATO is increasing its high readiness force to 300,000, Britain is going in a different direction.
So you would increase them again? I mean, there's 25,000 fewer troops, I think, under the government, according to your own research. Will you replace those 25,000?
Well, indeed, you're right. Throughout 13 years of a Labour government, we had over 100,000 full-time soldiers. In our Labour last year of government, we were spending 2.5% of our GDP, our national income, on defence.
So there will be an increase then under Labour?
That's the level that the Tories haven't matched since. We will always spend, as people can judge us from that record of the last 13 years, what's required to keep the country safe. The judgments we need to make on the threats we face, the capabilities we've got, the gaps that we need to fill, and the cost of those can only be done once we're in government.
But that's exactly, forgive me, John Healey, that's exactly the government's argument. They say the threat is no longer a ground threat, therefore they don't need as many troops. They're putting more money into technology, which is the way that battle is progressing. So, I mean, you're saying the same thing. So actually, you can't guarantee that you'd replace those 25,000 troops.
No, I'm not saying the same thing. In opposition, we simply don't have access to any of that information, which is all classified. We can only do that when we get into government. We'll undertake in the first year a strategic defence review, where we'll be able to look at and make those decisions on the plans to keep the country safe, the spending that's required, and the priorities for our armed forces capabilities. And we will put in, unlike this government, NATO first. We want Britain to be the leading European nation in NATO. We will review and make sure we can reinforce the UK homeland and defence of our overseas territories. That has been overlooked. And finally, there is more we can do to reinforce the important partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, but that needs us to be realistic about the military deployments we're able to put into that region. And we can do a great deal through diplomacy, through technology, through our capability exchange, and through our industrial collaborations. And Labour would back that if we get into government.
Before I let you go, we have the Israeli ambassador on the programme later on today, and we asked Oliver Dowden for the government about this. I mean, you mentioned anti-Semitism yourself in earlier parts of this interview. It's clearly a deep concern now for lots of people in this country who don't feel comfortable if they are Jewish, walking around cities when there are protests on. I mean, there are some Jewish people who are attending those rallies. Others feel that they don't want to be, around those people. What do you say to those who question if the terror attack on Israel was as bad as Israel says?
This was the worst and biggest attack and the largest number of Jews killed in a single day since the Holocaust. Nobody can deny how profound that attack was, and the deep fear for many Jews, not just for further attacks, but it calls into question the very continued existence of a safe homeland for Jewish people. That's why this runs so deep. And in this country, the rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the backwash of the conflict, this harrowing, anguishing conflict that we see on our screens and on social media, means that government and political leaders have to do more to reassure our communities, try and heal those divides, but also work, as we started to discuss, for a break in the fighting, an ability to get more aid into Gaza, more hostages out, and create the space where long-term diplomacy can provide the sort of solution, the two-state solution that has been overlooked and neglected for too long, as Keir Starmer argued in a very important speech that you mentioned earlier this week.
John Healey, just before you leave us, I know it's not your area of responsibility, but what would Labour do about homelessness, which is clearly an issue for many people in inner cities who don't like to see so many rough sleepers and tent cities?
The problem's not charities. The problem is government policy, and the tragedy of this and rough sleeping homelessness is we know what works because we've done it before. And Oliver Dowden was talking to you about the record of the last Labour government. I'm old enough to remember the early 1990s, before Labour came in 97, when we didn't have just tents on bits of parkland. We had whole tent cities across London. And when Labour came in, driven from number 10 Downing Street, we then reduced rough sleeping homelessness by 3/4. Now, we can do so again. We need to stop people losing their homes in the first place. The government this week in the King's speech could do what it's promised for 4 years, which is to end the no-fault evictions that private renters suffer from. And it could also make sure with those really problem long-term rough sleeping homeless people that we can increase the outreach teams and the emergency hostels, so that once we get them off the streets, there is support for them to stay off the streets. We've done it before. It can be done again, but it needs a determination and a will and a leadership from government that's just been missing, I'm afraid, in recent years.